We had sat there for quite some time, watching the elves conduct their worship. We had been in pursuit of an elf named Solsor, associated with a group of elven champions called the Agile, 6 elves that had a station of importance within Sunraiser. The layer of saints is where we had tracked Solsor and found the entirety of the Agile, all in this one simple procession. I turned towards Bulin, whose eyes seemed to be glancing left and right. He was observing the Agile as they kept their heads pointed upwards in prayer. I then turned towards Folty, who kept his eyes fixed on the priest. He watched attentively as the priest read from his book, possibly absorbing what the elf was and had been saying. I turned away from him and turned to Azadon, the guide that helped us gain entry to the lair of saints. I tapped his shoulder and leaned into his ear to whisper that I had needed to relieve myself. Of course. We should be heading to dinner anyways. Come, men, our guide stated as he stood up, the rest of us doing the same. He wished the guards in the room a farewell as we shuffled into the hallway and finally out of the elves' religious hall. Our guide led us down the street before turning off into an alleyway between 2 elven religious towers, where a fire was kept lit on its uppermost part. There was a sewer house hidden between them. Azadon waved his hand towards it as if presenting it as some sort of product to be purchased. I nodded and walked into the refuse room, hoping Tarbram was ready for the next step in our plan. As I sat down, I heard a momentary struggle outside, which ended in a wheeze. I stood up and left the sewer house to be met to the sight of an unconscious Azadon being held in the arms of Tarbram. He nodded to me and carried the ancient man to a spot behind the sewer house. We should count ourselves blessed that the elves do not leave behind noxious odors, Folty commented, Bulin chuckling in response. For once, humor was not my intention. Gather your wits about you then. We will surely require them in a short while, Tarbram stated as he stepped away from the sewer house. Now put on your cloaks and masks, swiftly. We all sifted through our packs for our masks and our cloaks, eventually finding them and adorning ourselves in the shadowy garbs. This practice of deception did not bode well with me. The courtesies we held ourselves to forbid dishonesty, as we were supposed to give our enemy the truth regardless of circumstance. Though I suppose the fact that we breached this city under our merchant guise simply means this deception is merely another layer onto our lie. Your kin are your own. Revere them with attention to their every word and silence to your doubts, Tarbram states as he places his hand on my shoulder. Is that not what our courtesies state? Of course, Brother Tarbram. It is our 5th courtesy, I responded, placing my clay mask upon my face. Do not disregard it this night. Otherwise, we shall fail in our quest. Trust me. I looked my eldest in his eyes to solidify my trust, but I was left wanting. His gaze was cold, distant, like the lunar body that follows the sun as it sets, yet devoid of the same majesty. I quickly looked away. I could not bear the sight. I felt a pat at my back, and Tarbram had stepped away towards the end of the alley. He turned towards the 3 of us then. Is our measly lot ready? He asked in a hushed tone. Absolutely, came Folty, visibly quaking in his boots. Always, brother, uttered Bulin, his fist clenching tight at his side. Lead on, I attested before I prayed to the Father for strength. Tarbram nodded, placing a mint in his mouth and a cloth mask over his face, as to hide the alchemic smog he breathed out. Tarbram turns to poke his head out of the alleyway, looking to his left, then to his right. He turns back towards us and signals for us to move with him. We crossed the street, watching our step as we crossed over to another alleyway. We traversed past a row of towers before coming to another avenue with which we had to cross. No guards were present to our left and our right once again, so we crossed into another alleyway between 2 rows of towers. Between 2 of these towers, there were stacks of crates and barrels. They were stacked to be half the height of the building it stood against. This must have been done by Tarbram while we were watching the religious procession. Tarbram points at Bulin, then points at the end of the alleyway. Bulin acknowledges the order and leaves to take watch as Tarbram conducts the next step of this plan. An assortment of sturdy daggers is pulled from his coat. He begins scaling up the wall, leaving a trail of these daggers behind to act as a ladder for us. The dagger blades were thick and dull, making them perfect for wedging between the bricks of the tower. He reached the top of the tower and crawled into its opening. He peeks his head over the railing to wave us upward. I wait for Folty to go first. He gulps, a large lump of air cramming down his throat. He steps on the first two knives, then grabs a hold of the next two. He places his foot on the next knife and grabs one of the two that lie above him, in ladder fashion. He slowly proceeds upwards, the first few rows of knives lying below him as he makes his way towards the top of the tower. The first mistake is made as he turns his head to look down at the ground. He tightens his body and freezes in place. His eyes clench shut, and he mutters to himself about how this was a mistake and that he shouldn't be up here. I hear Bulin groan softly to himself. I turn to him, placing my finger upon my lip to shush him. He turns back to his watch. I asked Folty to continue his climb, but he politely refused. I then grab a nearby pole that lay against a stack of crates and barrels and begin poking my brother in the leg. A second mistake is made, as his prodding only makes him refuse to climb any further. The knives. I feel like they're going to come loose. I might slip. I might yell. Please, I'll stay, and I'll keep watch. Folty pleads softly. Confound it, Folty. Show some courage. Scale the wall, I protested in a hushed fashion. I'm no good at this. You know of such. We do, Bulin comments softly. Hush and keep watch, I exclaimed as quietly as I could. Keep going, Folty. We're right behind you. Folty kept his eyes shut as he tried to take the next step upward. Folty muttered sorries to us as he attempted to grab the next pair of knives. After sluggishly making his way up the tower, Tarbram frustratedly pulled him into safety. He then turned to poke his head over the railings. He waves me up. I grab onto the first row of knives, taking a moment to pray to the Father before I begin my climb. After the utterance, I proceeded forth. As I climbed, I took note of the knife placement within the wall. The knives were, in fact, fairly loose, slightly wobbling as I took hold. Not enough to worry about the integrity of the ladder, but enough to give some concern to the likes of Folty. I supposed he braved a greater challenge than I realized. I kept climbing regardless until I reached the top of the tower. Tarbram pulled me onto the small wood platform at the top of the tower and peeked back over to wave Bulin up after I established my footing. I looked to Folty, who hides behind one of the brick corner columns that held the tower upward, taking moments to briefly look down at the ground. I then took note of the wood-fed fire which sat in the center of this floor of the building. It had some sort of significance to the elves, but the meaning escaped me. I took a moment then to view my surroundings at this elevated angle. The first thing that was made apparent was the shape of the elven church we sat in moments earlier. It encompassed a large area, roughly a quarter of a mile in diameter. It was shaped like a circle. The roof of this church was a mixture of wood and glass. Glass was fixed onto a wood frame, adhesive being used to keep it there. The roof took the shape of a cone, complementing the circular shape of the church. The glass was stained, half of it colored red and the other half colored white, similar to the scarves and robes of the elven sorcerers. It lacked any grime or residue, though that seems to be a given for all buildings in the Lair of Saints. Surrounding the church were more towers, similar to the one we stood upon. There was 5 rows and 5 sections, each section blocked off by the road below, and each row blocked off by an alleyway. There were 10 towers per row, meaning there were 50 in a section. There were 250 of these towers constructed around the church. Normally I had an idea on the significance of religious constructs, but the tower's meanings eluded me. I turned back to my brothers to see Bulin get to his feet, and to see Tarbram descending down his ladder of knives, hopefully retrieving them so as to not leave behind a trail for a guard to follow. It took a moment before Tarbram climbed over the railing, placing the knives back in his coat for later use. It's difficult to see, but if we ply off the glass pieces on the roof, we can access part of the building, Tarbram told us, walking towards the other side of the tower that faced the church. I walked over to the same side and surveyed it myself. He was correct. There was a room directly in front of us, underneath the glass roof. It had dim lights that revealed the shape of the isolated section of the church. What was inside the building? Tarbram inquired of me. A procession. This is the elves' temple. Do you see the brighter light shining through the middle rows of the glass tiles? I veered my gaze away from the ill-lit part of the building into what I assumed Tarbram was referring to. Several rows of tiles, lined across the midsection of the building, had intense light shining through it. Yes, I replied. We can assume that's where the procession is taking place. We best enter where the shadows reside. They aid us in our infiltration. He pulled 2 knives from his coat and stepped back towards the other end of the tower. He then took a running start towards the church. He stepped onto the railing and leapt from it. It almost seemed as if he were soaring through the air, over the near 30-foot gap that lay between the tower and the church. He landed upon the edge of the roof, the knives piercing some of the glass to keep him from sliding off of it. Folty leapt to his feet and ran up to the railing to view the sight, an expression of worry upon his face. Bielan did the same, though with less worry and more awe at the sheer boldness his brother had displayed. I thanked the father, as always. Tobram got to his feet quickly and widened his stance, then extended his arm towards my brothers and I. "Leap, and remember our fifth," he exclaimed as quietly as he could. Bielan had nudged Folty. Folty looked back at him. They both eyed each other down intensely. "Bielan, you first," I said, interfering as to stop any further theatrics from occurring. "Of course," Bielan replied, taking a few steps back. He took a running start, same as Tobram. Thankfully, Bielan had been much more agile than Tobram, and landed much further than our elder sibling after taking his leap. "Folty," I said. "You first, Brother Storn." I gave my brother a cold glare, one that presented my thoughts in a very visible manner. He sighed and took a few steps back. His legs quaked and his face grew pale. All I could do was offer my presence to him, which I know is not encouraging in these types of situations, but Folty must take initiative without excessive assistance. Mere moments had passed before he exhaled a deep breath and ran. His steps were lively, his motion was brave. His usual cowardice was set aside and the risk was taken. He leapt from the railing towards Tobram. He lacked the strength, but the spirit was ever present then. Tobram took hold of Folty's hands before he was given the chance to plummet to the ground. Folty let out a string of hushed curses, and Bielan had tried to withhold letting out a string of his own as he helped Tobram pull him up. As Folty got his bearings on the roof, Tobram extended his arm out to me. I took a few steps back in preparation, uttered a brief prayer, then remembered our fifth courtesy as I leapt from the tower to the roof. I flew through the air, the wind rushing through my hair, and past my face as I crossed the 30-foot gap. It took a few seconds before I had reached the other side, my body colliding with the church, my hand grasping Tobram's. I pressed my feet against the structure to ease my aging brother's burden. "My brothers remembered our fifth. Good," Tobram stated optimistically as he finished pulling me onto the roof. I got to my feet as quickly as I could and laid myself upon the roof to help catch my breath. "Now we tear off the glass," he says as he pulls one of his knives from his pocket and begins picking at the resin that bound the glass to the wood frame. Bielan crept closer to him, pulling one of his own knives to do the same. Bielan's knife was much sharper and had a greater effect against the resin. It took a few minutes before they had successfully tore through one side of the glue. "No one will be killing any elves while we are inside," Tobram started with as he began picking at the left line of the resin. "If we were to lash out, they might think the guide and yourselves were the cause of death, and we still need to travel around the city freely and openly." "Surely we shall return another time then, once we're more prepared if such is the case," Folty responded with. "No, if we're quick, the consequence will be naught," Tobram finished with as he peeled through the last bit of glue. He grabbed a hold of the edge of the tile and pulled it off, letting it slide down the roof slightly until it lay still. "Follow me," he uttered, slipping through the opening after. Bielan dropped inside, as did Folty, albeit hesitantly. I followed lastly, entering into a section of the church that appeared to be a storage room of sorts, filled with bins, crates, barrels, and various cabinets. Some were empty, while others were filled with dust-ridden robes and metal idols. Dimly lit candles lined the walls, upheld by copper mantles. I turned to my brothers who had taken to looking around the room as well, searching for anything that may be significant to our hunt, though, sadly, there wasn't. After the few minutes we had taken searching around the room, all we had found aside from the idols and robes were trays and cups. They were simplistic in design, but sturdy in structure. Tobram approached the closest exit out of the room, an old wooden door with a copper handle. He pulled on the handle, but it appeared to be locked. He cursed to himself before pulling out a key ring. It held a variety of keys he collected over his lifetime, specifically meant for situations such as this. I knew not their names, but I do know that he went through nearly a dozen before one worked, unlocking the door. A slight creak was made as Tarbram gently pushed it open. Folty closed his eyes briefly, while Bulin held his dagger at the ready. Tarbram peered in through the opening. He waved for us to follow him as he left. Bulin went second, Folty third. I followed lastly, gently closing the door. Tarbram relocked the door and put the keychain away in his pack. "Seems we must make a choice," Folty whispered as he took in our surroundings. The choice he was referring to was two hallways, one that went left from the storage room, and the one that lay directly in front of it, leading to another door, and another hallway to the left of that door. "Separate. Bulin with Storn, Folty with I. You take the left while I take the other door," Tarbram stated. "Are you sure I can't?" Folty began before being interrupted with a sudden "no" by Tarbram. Folty sighed and began walking with Tarbram to the other door while Bulin and I went left, further into the elf's sanctum. We followed a white carpet towards what appeared to be a staircase which led downwards. I heard elves talking in their accursed tongue. I drew one of my knives, as did Bulin. We steadily walked down the stairs, assuming a crouched position as we did so. As we came close to the foot of the stairs, I saw the source of the noise. Two elven guards chatted with each other, looking over a parchment of paper in the middle of a hallway. Their tone seemed argumentative, meaning we need no distractions to occupy them. There was a row of doors to our left and a door to our right. Further down the hall, I saw a split off to the right, and even further, another staircase that led downward. Bulin and I went straight for the first door we had seen on our left, which was unlocked. I peered through, checking for anyone who may have been inside. I saw a guard who stood in the corner of the room. I softly yanked the door back and turned my head towards Bulin, shaking my head. We continued on to the next door in this row. I attempted to open it, but it was locked. I turned back towards Bulin and shook my head again. He nodded and pointed for the door that was to our right. I walked over to it and gently pressed against it. It was unlocked, and I peered inside. I saw no one. I waited a moment before peeking through the keyhole, which I should have done prior to opening it, to see if there was any guard in an opposing corner of the room. There was not, and we walked inside, gently closing the door behind us. The room appeared to be a dyeing room. The walls were lined with red dyes kept in jars. Wood shelves above them held white scarves and gloves, neatly folded and kept. There was a large iron basin that contained a bundle of white scarves inside of it. A large roller rested atop it to assist in the dyeing process. Next to the basin lay a red scarf, possibly a color guideline for the dyers. Next to this basin was a table, one with some red dye powder clumped into a pile on a sheet of paper. Next to this clump was a pair of white gloves, and below the gloves, a book. I picked it up and flicked through it. It was in Elvish. Worthless, I thought to myself. I simply placed it back down. "Anything useful?" Bulin asked. "No," I muttered. "Then let's continue on," Bulin said, pointing to the door we entered from. We crept towards it, meekly. I ducked down to look through the keyhole and began opening it ever so slightly. As I nearly made an opening large enough for the two of us, I saw one of the guards, who were previously occupied, coming down the hall. It took notice of the door that was suddenly opening of its own volition, and came marching down to address it. I quickly backed up and turned to Bulin, then looked at the door that stood behind him and I. I began tiptoeing towards it, Bulin quickly at my heel, realizing our sudden change of plan was for a reason. I did the exact same at this door as I did at the other, crouching and looking through the keyhole as I opened it, though with great haste. I saw no one coming down the hallway on this side and quickly stepped out of the room. I gently closed the door behind us. I heard the elven guard speaking to itself from behind the door, bewildered with what had happened. Bulin quickly stepped over to a door, across from the one we had exited, and looked through the keyhole. He waved me over as he began to open it, still gazing through the keyhole. We stepped inside the room and shut the door behind us. The room we had entered was dimly lit, only a few candles to illuminate the various tables that rested in there. Stacks of red scarves lay on these tables, as well as gloves. A wooden washtub filled with dirty scarves and gloves sat near a large rectangular window, the window spanning nearly the entire room. There appeared to be a drying string that hung over a windowsill, the windowsill having a trough on it to collect water from wet clothing. I then turned to the table which had the scarves and gloves stacked atop it and found a book. Its cover had a lengthy title, as Elvish words covered half of it. I ignored it, though Bulin took to it rather quickly. He held it up to his face. "What do you see?" I asked in a hushed manner. "One of these words says sorcerer. I remember Folty showing me a few of their words and their definitions before coming here." "Foolish of me," I exclaimed to myself. "Folty knows Elvish. We should grab the book from the other room. Hurry! This room has nothing else that is of use." We left for the door, and I gazed into the keyhole, only to find a guard standing sideways to the door. I signaled for my brother to hold. It took a moment before the guard passed. I was about to open the door when I took notice of Folty and Tabram, who were startled by my opening of the door. They quickly ran for the stairs, but I opened the door and peeked my head out. They looked behind themselves, taking notice of my presence, and quickly walked down, entering the room after they did so. Folty wiped the sweat from his forehead, and Tabram began looking around the room. Bulin held up the book we found and pointed at the title. "A book about sorcerer customs," Folty said, almost a bit too loudly. We quickly shushed him, and he nodded his head in response. Good find, good find. We found one on religious history in the room across storage." "There's another in the other room that was to the left of you. We should head there and grab it." "No," Tabram responded. "Bulin and Folty will go grab it. You and I will head to a room I noticed further down the hall, and they will meet us there." I nodded in agreement, and we walked to the door. I began my approach as I did before, looking through the keyhole, and slowly opening the door. Tabram stood behind me, Bulin behind him, Folty behind Bulin. I crept slowly, and there were no elven guards down the hall. Tabram waited for my other siblings to enter the dining room, and pulled me along towards the room he had mentioned seeing. We eased our way down the hall, watching for any guards, until we reached the room in question. This room was in the middle of the hallway, same as the dining room, but there was only one door. 2 candle mantles were fixed on both sides of the door, as well as a metal plate which rested above the door. It had Elvish on it. It may have been a name, and if so, this was someone's office. Tabram and I stepped inside of the room after inspecting it for guards. I closed the door gently and turned to observe my surroundings. There was a wooden desk, ink pots atop it, as well as some paper that lay rolled up. Behind this desk was a bookshelf filled with volumes of Elvish nonsense. Nonsense that Folty may be able to make sense out of once he arrived. I searched around the room, but found nothing that wouldn't be missed. Best to cover our tracks as best as we could while we were here. Tabram began pulling open drawers of the desk, searching through stacks of rolled up paper and shoving aside plugged ink pots. I simply sighed and began searching through another set of drawers in this desk. I found the same items as him, ink pots and paper. The door to the office opened ever so slightly, Tabram and I ducking under the desk in response. I gripped my knife, as did he. The door was gently closed, and after the soft creak I heard a psst, then a "Storn, Tabram." I peeked my head up to see Folty and Bulin enter in, only one book in hand. "Was that book of any use?" I inquired. "No, merely dying instructions," Folty responded. He approached the bookshelf and began searching through the volumes that were there. Tabram pointed to Bulin, then to the door, indicating that we needed a lookout while Folty searched for information. I observed as he began pulling books from the shelves and then placing them back. "Merely historical texts, nothing about the Argyle. Let's see," he says before sliding his finger across a row of booklets. Tabram turned back towards Bulin, who kept watch. Folty tapped his finger across the books until he pulled one out. "This one's about the southern ranges, about the mountains there. Maybe there's something about the Argyle here," he states, flipping through the book. Behind me, all I could hear was a sudden creak. I turned my head around to look, to see the door being pushed towards Bulin. He stumbled back out of shock. The elven guard barged its way into the room. Tabram reached for his blade as I reached for mine. The elf drew its axe, an angry scowl across its face as it gazed upon the men that infiltrated its sanctum. It stepped towards us, but before it could get a foot further, Bulin had leaped onto the elf's back. The elf struggled with him for a moment, but it was no match for our hunter's ferocity. Bulin overtook the elf, who was powerless to his rage and his might. My brother drew his blade, his hand trembling from the rush of battle. He quickly plunged his dagger into the throat of the elf, and ended its life upon the white carpets, staining it crimson. The third mistake was made.